So today I want to talk about May Day and the 8-hour workday. First and foremost, I want to wish everybody a happy International Workers' Day. And for those of you who may not be aware, the origins of May Day or International Workers' Day is actually born out of the struggle for the 8-hour workday. When workers set out on May 1st, 1886 across the United States in a strike that would lead up to the May 4th Haymarket Massacre, the strikers cried out with slogans such as 8-hour day with no cut in pay, and 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, 8 hours for what we will. Now, we're currently living in a reality where the work week in the United States has shifted a lot and has more and more either become gig jobs that functionally require countless hours or has shifted into part-time labor positions where shorter shifts are spread out across the week and the need for multiple minimum wage jobs in addition to food stamps have become required for families to even attempt to survive. It has become quite the norm for many people to experience work weeks in the 60 to 80-hour range, even in homes that have dual incomes. And within that context, I think it's important to remember that the battle for an 8-hour day and a 40-hour work week was already won in the United States once, and was already fought for in that context. I also would like to point out that it was part of an international movement in which multiple different organizations from many different countries fought their respective industries and capital and governments in order to secure this position of an 8-hour workday. And so when we look at it from this current position in terms of labor, we have to acknowledge that we've actually lost ground in this regard. Now, for those of us who do have full-time employment, the 40-hour work week and 8-hour day are considered to be normalized standards. To work beyond this is to provide and create some sort of guaranteed overtime pay. This is federally mandated in the United States by law, with increased wages such as time and a half if you go beyond the standard 40 hours. And to those of us in these full-time positions, it is important to remember that this relatively normalized idea, something that seems kind of normal, is still something that had to be fought for through rallies and protests and strikes by labor, even in the form of something approximating a general strike. Now, it was not unheard of in the not-so-distant past for businesses to demand of their workers a 6-day week with 10 to 12-hour shifts, sometimes even up to 14 to 16-hour shifts that workers were just expected to perform and do on a daily basis and weekly basis. As early as 1791, people were actually seeking shorter work hours, as carpenters in Philadelphia went on strike in favor of a 10-hour workday. And this was designed in such a way as to have a 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. shift where 10 hours would be spent for work and 2 hours would be spent on meals. And throughout the 19th century, as labor fought more and more for this 8-hour workday, not just in the US but internationally, the idea that workers deserve to be able to have an 8-hour period of leisure was seen as something absurd that many companies actually fought against by paying for private police and guards in order to enforce the long hours onto people, instead of paying workers for these 8-hour shifts or giving in to the demands that people could maybe work for 8 hours and have their shift taken over by somebody else. They decided to pay for actual police forces to enforce their current standards and position. At that point, one must question whether or not that was even economically feasible or became about a power play at that point. But I do need to point out that when these guards and police forces clashed with workers during strike after strike and rally after rally throughout the 19th century, that they received the support of government, and that blood was spilt in the name of workers demanding an 8-hour workday, something that we've come to assume is somewhat a normal position. People literally died in the name of an 8-hour workday and a 40-hour work week. And that's something really important to remember in terms of labor history. It's also important to remember that this seemingly basic idea of an 8-hour day was actually propped up by an unpaid domestic labor force. This labor force of workers was meant to be able to provide the majority of income for the family. So when people went out on the 40-hour work week or went out to the factory jobs that they may have had, that was supposed to be enough income to support a family, not just a single individual. So in that, it was assumed that somebody might be home taking care of the domestic work. And that role almost exclusively fell onto women, who were seen as responsible for taking care of and raising children. All the while, they were meant to be cooking, cleaning, and providing for all other manner of domestic work, in addition to any paid work that they may or may not have had to do to supplement the household's income. This, of course, differed across racial lines, where certain populations had to have people working outside the home more often than others. But in either case, domestic work that propped up under capitalism and was propping the capitalist machine up was largely supplied by the unpaid work of women, who were often made dependent on men for their social positions. And that is something to remember whenever we talk about this 40-hour work week. It was supplemented by an entire set of labor and work with countless hours where women were doing the domestic chores to uphold that 40-hour work week as the standard. Now, it's also worth noting that even though we celebrate International Workers' Day due to this event in 1886 with the Haymarket Massacre, it still would take the United States almost half a century of additional strikes, protests, and rallies before the 40-hour work week would become normal and codified into law. In 1898, for example, the United Mine Workers actually fought for and successfully won the 8-hour workday for their workers. In 1905, printing trades actually began to start using the 8-hour workday. And it wasn't until 1914 when the Ford Motor Company normalized the 8-hour workday in their factories that was pushed, of course, by constant pressure from the outside, that some of it became kind of normalized. And it took all of this of constant pressure, constant fighting, and bloodshed, and blood being spilled by human beings, demanding better working conditions for this to finally happen, and for changes in labor to begin to occur. All the while, during all of these minor gains, it was normal, again, for people to be working between 10 and 14-hour shifts, as unions were fought against by businesses and governments alike. Now, it's not until 1916 that the federal government, passes the Adamson Act, the first law that solidified an 8-hour workday and put a mandate on private businesses, was passed in the United States. Now, this was exclusively for railroad workers, but it represented a shift where it was the first position where the government felt it was necessary to intervene in the struggle between capital and workers, and allowed for workers to get this one minor gain of the 8-hour workday as a kind of bargaining with workers, especially those who may have had more leftist understandings and leanings, to kind of bargain their position in capital. Now, furthermore, it was not until 1937 when the Fair Labor and Standards Act was passed as part of the New Deal, in which we would see a standardized federal mandate for the 40-hour work week. And this compromise with capital and the formation of unions and the protection of them ended up allowing for this particular thing to become standard for quite a number of years. But the history of blood being spilt, with consistent coordinated strikes and protests in the street, is often washed out in this normalization of the 9-to-5 full-time position and the way that capital and workers ended up coming to a sort of compromise in the exploitation of workers. And that history of labor rising up in the name of unions, socialism, communism, and anarchism is often erased in this compromise with capital and the seemingly, seeming position of the 8-hour workday turning into something normalized, and as if it's something that has always and will always exist, when that has not been the case and probably will not be the case in the future. Now, as I mentioned before, even that 8-hour workday and 40-hour work week has become less and less standard for people in the United States, as people have been funneled into these part-time and gig labor positions that have forced labor into sometimes having 60 to 80-hour work weeks, while CEOs and corporations bring home record incomes and profits. Now, with automation being what it is time, I think, for people to start to demand something different. And that will have to manifest in the formation of things like a universal basic income. And to be perfectly honest, shorter work weeks at a bare minimum with much better pay. With technology evolving in the way that it has, there is no justification for why a society that has historically functioned with a normalized 8-hour day and a 40-hour work week could not strive using this advanced technology for a 20-hour work week with a 4-hour work day at a bare minimum. We could probably do far better than that, but that's a bare minimum that I'd feel comfortable advocating for. Perhaps it's time that we start organizing and developing ourselves and working in tandem with one another as we call for what is now part-time to become full-time. And we say it loud and we say it proud, borrowing from this historic tradition, 4 hours a day and no drop in pay. And for those who feel that this idea is ridiculous or absurd, I want to remind you that once upon a time, it was said that the 8-hour day and the 40-hour work week were impossible, that they were pipe dreams, that it was demanded of workers that they work 10, 12, 14-hour shifts. And it will take pressure and strategic planning and a lot of work and a lot of discussions and a lot of trying to bring people together in a movement. But the idea of a UBI and a shorter work week mixed with concepts like universal healthcare, housing rights, and so much more are far from impossible given the wealth that this society is capable of producing, even compared to the gains that were made by the time of 1937, where a lot of capital even agreed to compromise on their position of normalizing an 8-hour work day and a 40-hour work week. And in that regard, shouldn't we be able to do better with all of the technological advancements that we've made? Further, I dare say that beyond the United States itself, it would be important to make this an international movement, one where an 8-hour day is no longer the standard, where it becomes a 4-hour day, because the 8-hour day in its international history has already been won and passed, and we can and should be able to be doing better. That shared history and our potential future is what I'd like you to consider at the bare minimum of what we could fight for and what we deserve as workers in this society as we move forward and in societies across the world. That is the legacy that we should be looking back at and looking forward upon on this May Day. So again, happy International Workers' Day, everyone. And with that said, I hope if you like this video, you consider subscribing, giving it a thumbs up, and hitting the bell for notifications. You can follow me on Twitter and check out my Discord in the description down below. We have a wonderful community there where we do advocate for workers' rights and so much more. And with that said, my name is Anarchist Tara, and I hope you enjoyed watching.